Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What is on My Wrist, we are talking about a Universal Genève, blah, blah, blah. Somebody's gonna be like, Cam's not saying Universal Genève right.
Not saying it right.
Is it Audemars or Audemars? It's like tomato.
Tomato.
Right? It's like, I'm not like calling out the Australians and the British guys for calling Omegas Omegas. Like, WTF? Audemars Piguet, Universal Genève or Genève? I think it's Genève. It's Universal Genève from Geneva. Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What is on My Wrist, we're talking about a 1967-1968 Universal Genève Space-Compax. The reference is 885104/01. That is a mouthful because this is an awesome and very complicated watch. There's a lot of really interesting Universal Genèves outside of just the pull routers. There's the Space-Compax, and they made a whole range of steel sport watches, which are really, really interesting. And the Space-Compax is definitely one of them in the chronograph range of watches that came from the brand in the late 1960s into the early 1970s. Universal Genève created its first chronograph in 1917, and roughly 18 years later, they actually launched their first compacts, in which many variations were to follow, the Space-Compax being one of them. As we mentioned, Universal Genève sports watches in particular are sought after thanks to their variety and unique designs, and the larger sports watch case sizing, like this Space-Compax. In particular, the Universal Genève Space-Compax ref 885104/01 was designed to endure harsh conditions while supporting excellent functionality. And what's interesting about this watch is most of them are from 67, 68, kind of 69. The serial range is a little bit fuzzy for Universal Genève, and there isn't an exact science to put an exact date on watches. What's interesting about this watch in particular, and some of the other watches that have hit auction and have come to market, is the bracelet actually will have a date code. So that gives us some indication as to the production period of the watch. For example, this one was, the bracelet at least was produced in the first quarter of 1967. So we know roughly the watch is either 1967 or 1968, somewhere in there. But what's interesting about the Space-Compax in particular is that it was a watch that was produced to kind of compete with Daytonas, and more specifically, maybe the Omega Speedmasters of the time. If you think back 67, 68, 69, Omega was catching a lot of the limelight for them being a major part of the space program. So I think that this watch was marketed and kind of created by Universal Genève to directly compete with the Omega Speedmaster, so to speak. But what's interesting about the watch from a form meeting function type of perspective is that the watch is its own thing. It's not really a Daytona, it's not really a Speedmaster. It definitely is in a category of its own, and in some cases I think kind of superior to the Speedmaster in many ways, and we can kind of go into those details. What's interesting too about the watch, in this one in particular, is that this one is the nicest one that I have ever seen. I've seen a few Space-Compaxes. I wouldn't say Space-Compaxes. Is that correct? I don't know. Somebody's probably gonna light me up on that. But I've seen a good number of Space-Compax examples, and there's some minor nuances and details and references. For example, I've seen them with black pushers like this, and also gray pushers. The theory behind the gray pushers is that they were once black, and that the rubber cap over the pusher fades to like a gray coloration, or Universal Genève could have offered them in both gray and black. So let's talk about some of the differences between this and, let's say, a Daytona and or a Speedmaster from the era. One thing that's really interesting is it's kind of a watch that, yes, it has space in the title, and maybe that was kind of a marketing kind of ploy by Universal Genève to keep up with what was happening with just space and that kind of like adventure type of mindset of the era. But what's interesting is you have a chronograph, you have a dive watch, and you have kind of this interesting kind of thing of its own. What's interesting with the Space-Compax is, unlike an Omega Speedmaster or a Daytona that has a tachometer on the outside of the watch, or having a fixed bezel, this actually has a rotating bezel, which is similar to like a dive watch. So we have a luminous pip at the 12 o'clock position, and then we have a fully gradiated bezel, which could be used to, time a dive potentially, or keep track of time while, also having chronograph functionality, which is really interesting. The vibe and the feel of this watch is really interesting. We have an asymmetrical case. So similar to a Speedmaster Professional, we have kind of these built-in crown and pusher guards, so to speak. So the case is actually wider on one side, but also what's interesting is this asymmetrical kind of design and feel really works for the watch. Also, unlike the Speedmaster and similar to the Daytona, we've got a locking winding crown. So this watch runs off of a Valjoux 72, which is very similar to a Daytona, and also has a kind of an oversized winding crown, but also it's locking. So that was a major difference between the Omega Speedmaster, which was obviously the moon watch, the NASA flight qualified watch. We've got a kind of an interesting design on the pushers. These are actually rubber caps. So we've got a non-locking pusher that has a rubber cap over it that would yield a higher water resistance, which I think is kind of a cool innovation to come from the brand. Obviously, we didn't see screw down pushers in the Daytona range until the 6263 or 6265. And the other thing is Omega doesn't have a locking pusher. They've got a water resistant pusher, but something that isn't waterproof. So I think that in a lot of ways, the Space-Compax was kind of an evolution of Universal Genève looking at what was out there from a chronograph perspective in that era, and kind of taking the best of all these other elements and plopping them into one watch, which makes for a really interesting reference. Stylistically, the watch is really, really cool. First thing is we have blued, kind of like interesting, I don't know if you want to call them cigarette style hands, but these broad chronograph hands, which is very common for Universal Genèves. You'll see that in like the Nina Rent or the Evil Nina. They've got these like big kind of blocky, high visibility chronograph subdial hands. These are actually blued, which is kind of a nice touch. You would see that in something that is more fine watchmaking. Blued hands are something that you would see in something that is a little bit more couture, if that makes sense. But to see it in a sports watch is kind of a nice touch. And then we've got these big, broad, minute and hour hands with a big, broad sweep seconds hand, paired with an Art Deco font in the subdials, as well as at the 12 o'clock position on this as well. So if you look at, for example, like the sub-C range of watches from Universal Genève, you have this Art Deco font, which is really, really interesting and cool. Another kind of interesting thing is that the markers on the dial itself are not loomed. You actually have these loomed dots similar to maybe kind of like a Datejust or something like that. It's kind of its own thing. It's a high visibility dial. You could say it's kind of comparable to maybe a Speedmaster in the sense that it's a printed dial. There isn't a raised marker, which is something that we'll see in the Daytona range of watches. There was an applied stick marker, whereas this is printed and loomed at the same time. So really, really interesting watch. Again, it's Valjoux 72, so kind of the cool thing about that is very similar to a Daytona, also similar to, let's say, like a Speedmaster, meaning that it's a manually wound chronograph. Big fan of the Valjoux 72 movements, and also like Valjoux 727s, which we'll find in the 6263, 6265 range of Daytonas. Another really interesting thing too is this has a Gayfarer's bracelet, and this specific example being the nicest one that we've ever seen. The case is completely unpolished. The bezel is free from any kind of marking or degradation. The dial is flawless. The hands are perfect. There's no loom degradation. And then the bracelet is just stacked, which is really, really interesting. Normally these bracelets, just due to their construction, can kind of get loose if they've been worn over time. And the other thing that's kind of cool is we've got a flip lock clasp. I love this U logo on kind of the inside of the clasp. I just, the whole thing is just awesome. But This example in particular is the nicest one that I've ever seen. I've looked at a good number of them, and this was definitely worthy of some time on the wrist and definitely worth discussing because, again, Universal Genève is something that is coming up more and more. I'm getting asked a lot of questions about Universal Genève. We're a big fan of the Pole Router series of watches, and you know, the brand is awesome. So in any case, thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll provide a link in the description below so you can check this out. And be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see you in the next one. See you later.